Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. At the end of last week's chapter dealing with the rise of China, the consequences of China's rise upon America's preeminence, I mentioned Donald Trump's protectionist policy. Donald Trump justified his decision to raise the tariffs on goods imported from China by the idea, he alluded to the idea that the argument that China was benefiting from the rules of today's international trade, the rules of the World Trade Organization. Listen to Donald Trump. This is a speech he held 2 years ago, in September 2018 at the United Nations.
The United States lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, nearly a quarter of all steel jobs, and 60,000 factories after China joined the WTO. And we have racked up $13 trillion in trade deficits over the last 2 decades. But those days are over. We will no longer tolerate such abuse. We will not allow our workers to be victimized, our companies to be cheated, and our wealth to be plundered and transferred. America will never apologize for protecting its citizens. The United States has just announced tariffs on another $200 billion in Chinese-made goods, for a total so far of $250 billion. I have great respect and affection for my friend, President Xi, but I've made clear our trade imbalance is just not acceptable. China's market distortions and the way they deal cannot be tolerated. As my administration has demonstrated, America will always act in our national interests.
Hi, everyone.
This argumentation of Donald Trump perfectly introduces today's topic, dealing with cooperation, international regimes, multilateralism. The World Trade Organization, you know that, is the successor organization of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that was adopted in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the same time as the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank in the domain of economic international interactions. Who decided that these institutions should be established in order to rule the domain of trade, of monetary relations, of reconstruction? The US is at the origin of these institutions. Why? Because of the then American leadership. America was the major winner of World War II, and of course, in order to consolidate over the long run, it had an interest in creating these institutions, establishing rules that regulated the interactions in order to profit itself from said rules, but also in order to associate secondary powers, satisfied powers. We saw this term in our 2 first chapters, in order to associate secondary powers to the benefit of this order. If we accept Trump's argumentation, then he comes to the conclusion that nowadays the World Trade Organization profits China and no longer profits the US. In other words, he considers that it is no longer in America's interest to respect those rules that were adopted under America's hegemony when America was the prevailing power. Nowadays, according to Trump, America has to act in our, I quote, in our national interest. My hypothesis then, ladies and gentlemen, in this chapter, and this is the reason why I chose the title that I chose, my hypothesis consists in saying that the US RegimeMaker after World War II is transforming itself, or tempted to transform itself under the Trump administration into a regime breaker, a regime maker as opposed to a regime breaker. What do these two terms mean? A regime maker is a power, a major power, a set of major powers, but first and foremost, one single major power, unipolarity. We saw this last week. A regime maker is a major power creating regimes, that is to say, proposing and inciting other states to adopt, to accept, to adopt international norms, international institutions, international rules, international organizations whose aim is to regulate peacefully the international society in different domains. A regime breaker then logically is a state coming to the conclusion that it's no longer in its interest to respect these rules. It therefore aims at breaking the regime, that is to say, no longer respecting the rules, because these rules, these norms, or the fact to respect them is considered, is perceived to be detrimental to its own interests. And somewhere in between the regime makers and regime breakers, we have the regime takers. The regime takers, that is to say the secondary powers, by definition the satisfied secondary powers, who accept the rules because they perceive these rules to benefit, to profit their own specific national interest. In the domain of trade, of course, this was the case since 1945 for the Western liberal states, the Western liberal capitalist economies. So the US then is tempted to transform itself nowadays into a regime breaker. Why? Because beyond the domain of trade that we alluded to by referring to Trump's protectionist policies, a protectionist policy that is also that has also been adopted by Trump in America's trade relations with Europe and with Canada and with Mexico. He proposed to abandon the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreements and to replace it by the so-called USMCA agreement, that is the US-Mexico-Canada agreements. Not merely in the domain of trade, but more generally in different domains, the US under Trump is acting more and more often unilaterally, putting into practice Donald Trump's America First doctrine, that is to say, withdrawing from international regimes, such as, if you look at the first document in the file at your disposal on Moodle, America decided in January 2017 to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership with East Asian economies. It decided in June 2017 that America should withdraw from the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement on climate change that was adopted in Paris in 2015 under Obama's presidency. It decided in October 2017 that America should withdraw from the UNESCO, the UN agency whose aim is to protect the world's cultural heritage. It decided to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal, the nuclear deal that was adopted in 2015 by Iran and the five permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. In 2019, Trump decided to withdraw from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that had been signed 32 years ago in 1988 by Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, and that treaty contributed to the end of the Cold War, the peaceful end of the Cold War. Last but not least, on May 29 this year, 2020, the US withdrew from the World Health Organization because Trump accused this organization to protect China, where the coronavirus crisis started, and the World Health Organization was accused by Trump of protecting China at the moment when this crisis became a pandemic spreading to all the other countries. In the domain of international strategic affairs, international security, Donald Trump, acted unilaterally too. He criticized NATO. We'll come back to this in another chapter. He also criticized the US-Japan security treaty, claiming that Japan was profiting from this treaty. He decided that America should recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. This he announced in December 2017, and in May 2018, the American embassy indeed moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In disregard of the UN resolutions, he also disregarded the UN resolutions since 1967, the 6 Days War, when deciding or when announcing 1 year ago that Israeli settlements in the West Bank do not violate the UN resolutions. He decided 1 year ago, in 2019, that America should withdraw his troops from the northern part of Syria, Kurdish Syria. In doing so, he permitted Turkey to invade and to occupy this part of Syria. And he justified this decision by claiming that America should put an end to the endless wars it has been fighting since 2001, by claiming that American soldiers should defend America rather than intervening everywhere in the world. This is his argumentation put forward, pronounced during a speech at the West Point graduation ceremony last June 13. We are restoring the fundamental principles that the job of American soldier is not to rebuild foreign countries. Their job is to defend and defend strongly our nation from foreign enemies. We are ending the era of endless wars. In its place is a renewed, clear-eyed focus on defending America's vital interests, which are not at stake in other countries. It is not the duty, I go on quoting, it is not the duty of US troops to solve ancient conflicts in faraway lands that many people have never heard of. And the last sentence, very significant. We are not the policemen of the world. We are not the policemen of the world. Significant because it's somehow at least implicit allusion to Franklin Delano Roosevelt post-World War II projects when he coined the expression "one world, four policemen." Ladies and gentlemen, Trump's behavior endangers the liberal international order which the US established after 1945 and which Wilson already had imagined as early as 1918, 1919. But you know that Wilson's projects, League of Nations, were rejected by the US Senate. The US Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, which included the League of Nations Treaty, and therefore the League of Nations Charter, and therefore the US did not become a member of the League of Nations. But in 1945, America definitely decided to intervene on the world political stage. To some extent, even as early as 1942, Roosevelt imagined, conceived of what this post-World War II order should look like. It should be a liberal international order. This is what he said, that is what he put down in the draft of the Atlantic Charter signed with Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, in 1942, eager to promote a liberal order both in the domestic settings of the different states and on the international scene. He claimed that political liberty, the right of self-determination, should prevail in domestic affairs, free trade, and the abandonment of the use of force on the international scene. So this was the liberal ideal. But you know that, of course, the Soviet Union in 1945 rejected this American vision of the post-World War II international order. The Soviets had their own communist vision. So what did the US do? It applied a fairly liberal policy when dealing with, logically, the Western liberal democracies, the Western European ones, Canada, Australia, Japan. And it adopted a realist-inspired containment strategy when dealing with the Soviet adversary. And the UN became a kind of compromise, and here Roosevelt proposed the expression "one world, four policemen." The four policemen became five policemen, France was accepted as the fifth permanent member of the UN Security Council, these 5 policemen should maintain international security and international peace on the globe. This program, throughout the Cold War, and all the more so throughout the post-Cold War world, up to Obama included, of course, this program, this plan, all the American presidents respected it, and they consolidated the liberal international order. Clinton, notably, in the 1990s, Trump makes in his speech that you heard some minutes ago, Clinton makes an allusion to the World Trade Organization that China joined. After China joined the World Trade Organization, it is destroying the jobs of American workers. It is the America of Clinton that invited China to join the World Trade Organization. We mentioned this last week. The underlying assumption of Clinton's engagement strategy was that by asking China to join and to participate in international institutions in general and the World Trade Organization more specifically, China would be gradually transformed into a satisfied power, and in this case, there would be no risk of a non-stable transition period in the case of America decline. So Clinton, Obama, they all consolidated the liberal international order in general, and all the more so when dealing with their Western partners. Of course, we have to admit that Trump is not the first American president since 1945 to act unilaterally. So did George Bush, the son, George Walker Bush, in 2003, when he decided unilaterally to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom to get rid of Saddam Hussein. This war was launched without any authorization by a UN resolution. George Bush, the son, also put an end to the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty that had been signed by the Soviets, Brezhnev, and the Americans, Nixon, in 1972. And this end of the ABM regime is at the origin of America's national missile defense projects, consisting in putting defensive missiles aiming at intercepting enemies' missiles in Eastern European countries. Nixon himself also acted unilaterally in the 1970s, in 1971, when he put an end to the Bretton Woods regime. The Bretton Woods regime, because he considered that the rules established at Bretton Woods were favoring Europe, the European community, the then European community, and Japan. Their economies were growing quicker than the American one. And of course, Ronald Reagan also acted unilaterally. He was the first to decide that America should leave the UNESCO. It is George Walker Bush who, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, decided that America should reintegrate it. Before Trump, we saw this at the beginning, announced once again that America would withdraw. It is Reagan who decided to withdraw a first time from the UNESCO, and Ronald Reagan also, of course, is known for deregulating the economy and thus favoring the contemporary globalization and maybe the crises of that are the consequences of this globalization. This is an argument I am not smart enough to go into the details. So Trump is not the first to act unilaterally, but what is specific to him, what is unprecedented, is obviously that he endlessly repeats decisions synonymous with unilateral actions. This behavior is fairly unprecedented. And this is the reason why, ladies and gentlemen, he's pretty often criticized. He's criticized by a lot of people, and for instance, his Western allies too, notably Emmanuel Macron. Listen to how the French TV, the French international TV network, France 24, France 24, sums up the opposition between Macron and Trump's conception of multilateralism versus unilateralism. Of course, the French anchorman, who comments on this opposition, is anything but objective. He is in favor of the French position. He expresses his master's voice, just as Fox News expresses American presidents, American Republican conservative presidents' voices. So listen to this opposition.
Two leaders, two opposite visions of the world. For French President Emmanuel Macron, global inequalities may only be tackled through international cooperation.
It is only together that we can effectively push back against all of these inequalities which have eroded our societies. Mistrust, isolationism are fueled by our inability to act.
Speaking earlier, US President Donald Trump unashamedly defended his America First agenda, saying it was the right of every nation to pursue its own path in the world.
We will not allow our workers to be victimized, our companies to be cheated, and our wealth to be plundered and transferred. America will never apologize for protecting its citizens.
On almost every subject, from trade to climate change and Iran, the two leaders defended radically different approaches.
We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Cette voie, je l'affirme ici. This doctrine is one of unilateralism.
De l'unilatéralisme.
It leads directly to isolationism and to conflict.
Et au conflit.
At times directly referring to the US President, Emmanuel Macron urged world leaders to continue working together.
Vous habituez pas.
Please, do not get used to it. Don't become indifferent. Do not accept the erosion of multilateralism. Do not accept our history unraveling. I am not getting used to this.
After both speeches were made, it seems the main political divide now is between globalists and nationalists.
The objective of this chapter, ladies and gentlemen, is to try to account for Trump's unilateral behavior. How can we explain the decision of Trump to more and more often act unilaterally, and what may be the consequences of this unilateral behavior? In order to do so, we have to go back, as usual, to theory, and more specifically to a debate characterizing the American discipline of international relations some 30 years ago, during the 1980s, the so-called neo-realist, neo-liberal debate regarding cooperation, regarding international regimes. International regimes, defined in this book by Stephen Krasner, an American neo-realist author. International regimes are, I quote the definition, sets of implicit or explicit principles, norms, rules, and decision-making processes around which expectations of actors converge in a given area of international relations. International regimes, in other words, the term is synonymous with international institutions, with multilateralism. Multilateralism is the fact for states to establish common rules, common principles, common norms of behavior, defining adequate behavior, prohibiting inappropriate behavior, rules that the states who establish them commit themselves to respect. Commit themselves to respect whatever the context, that is to say, promising when signing treaties, when establishing the rules, promising that they will go on respecting these rules, whatever the context, that is to say, whatever their national interest, even in the case of their national interest being different from the one that prevails at the moment they are signing the treaty or establishing the rules. This is important, ladies and gentlemen. Multilateralism is more than merely resulting to a dialogue, to a kind of consensus to establish rules. It is also the promise to respect them in the future. What I want you to know, and what I feel free to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, is that pretty often mistakes are committed, errors are committed, confusions are committed between multipolarity and multilateralism on the one hand, between unipolarity and unilateralism on the other hand. Please do not commit these confusions. Unipolarity and multipolarity, you know that, we saw it in our first two chapters, refer to the power distribution, the configuration of major powers, the structure based on what the different powers possess as material resources, economic and military. Unilateralism and multilateralism these two terms refer to the process by which states establish the rules that they accept to follow, either alone, unilateralism, or together, multilateralism. More important, even more important, the confusion which is pretty often committed is to establish a correlation between multipolarity and multilateralism and between unipolarity and unilateralism. That is to say, pretty often those who criticize unipolarity also believe that unipolarity implies unilateralism. Therefore, they are favorable, and this is the case of France, they are favorable to multipolarity because they believe that multipolarity is synonymous with multilateralism. Actually, there is no correlation at all between multipolarity on the one hand and multilateralism, and there is no correlation between unipolarity and unilateralism. I would even go as far, and this is what I would like to show, or this is what I hope I will be able to show, I would go as far as saying that multilateralism, the fact to establish rules by common consent and to go on respecting them in the future, multilateralism only is possible and survives thanks to a unipolar structure. I will try to show this. To do so, I will come back to the neo debate, the neoliberal, neo-realist debate. This debate is related about international regimes, about multilateralism. It is related to the debate about the question of cooperation. International relations, you know that, and this postulate is shared by the two neoliberal and neo-realist approaches. This is why a debate is possible. A debate is only possible among people who agree upon common starting points. The common starting point for this debate is that anarchy is prevailing. In other words, no state, no central authority above states tells the states what they are supposed to do. No central authority sanctions them if they do not do what they should be supposed to do. Given this absence of central authority above states, are states, this is the question, are states interested in cooperating? And if yes, how do they proceed to make such cooperation possible? As usual, the debate starts with the neo-realist approach. Neo-realism at that time being dominating in the discipline, the American discipline of international relations. Strictly speaking, for realists, there can be no cooperation. This is true for offensive realists, such as Hobbes, the state of war, such as Morgenthau, international politics is power politics. Such every state tries to impose its will upon every other state. This is true for Mearsheimer, the contemporary offensive neo-realist, who published an article some 15 years ago or so about the false promise of international institutions. But also the defensive realists, in this case defensive neo-realists, claim that cooperation is hardly possible, if not impossible. This is the case of Kenneth Waltz, the best and the brightest neo-realist scholar. In his first book, 59, this PhD dissertation, Man, the State and War, where he refers to the philosopher who influenced his own approach. This philosopher is not Thomas Hobbes, as was the case, at least implicitly, for Morgenthau. This philosopher was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French Jean-Jacques Rousseau, thinker of the Enlightenment century. Rousseau is known for his social contract. Rousseau also wrote a shorter essay, one of his first essays, called Discourse on the Origin of the Inequality Among Men, He depicts in the short essay the state of nature among primitive men. And these primitive men, he calls them noble savages. Why noble savages? Because they live in isolation. They have almost no social contact at all, no social interaction with other primitive men. And this is the reason why they are happy. And this is the reason why their life is peaceful, as opposed to Thomas Hobbes's violent state of nature. Listen to Rousseau. The noble savage is living a predominantly solitary life, I quote, satisfying his hunger at the first oak, slaking his thirst at the first brook, finding his bed at the roots, at the foot of the tree which provides him his meal, and with that all his wants supplied. A very simple life, and therefore a happy and a peaceful life, synonymous with isolationism. According to Rousseau, only on very rare occasions did the primitive noble savage decide that he should join other noble savages. And the most important of these occasions was when he needed other primitive means help to try and to catch and to try and to kill a prey sufficient enough to satisfy all the hunters' hunger during weeks or so. And according to Rousseau, it is during such an occasion that the so-called stag hunt dilemma occurred. Let's have a look at this stag hunt metaphor, which will be used by Kenneth Waltz. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. So Rousseau imagined 5, 6, 7 primitive noble savages, primitive hunters, gathering in order to cooperate, in order to catch a significant prey such as a stag, permitting them to eat their fill during various weeks. This explains why they decided to cooperate, since most of the time they live in isolation. They decided to cooperate because at that time there was a coincidence between their private interest, their singular interest, and the common interests of all the hunters taken together. The private interest, of course, is that by catching such a prey, each hunter individually will have enough food for weeks. The common interest is that each hunter needs every other hunter, since no hunter individually is strong enough, runs quickly enough to trap, to catch, and to kill a huge prey, a significant prey, a big animal, such as a stag. Without this coincidence, there would have been no cooperation, no gathering. So let's imagine these 5, 6, 7 primitive hunters positioning themselves, adopting their position in the primitive forests, some to look for the stag, the other ones to push it in a hole, and the third ones to kill him with the then primitive weapons. According to Rousseau, a dilemma very quickly emerged. A dilemma arose when one rabbit came within the reach of one of the hunters. And the dilemma was the following one. Should the hunter concerned seize the rabbit? Because in doing so, he would have enough food, not for weeks, but at least for some days. So he would satisfy his immediate private interest. Or should he forego the rabbit, that is to say, keep his promise, in order for all the hunters to have a chance to catch the stag? In other words, the dilemma emerged, the dilemma arose because there was no longer coincidence between the private interest of the hunter within the reach of which a rabbit arrived, and the common interest of all the stag hunters. The particular interest, the private interest, the singular interest told, in the mind of the primitive hunter, told the hunter to catch the rabbit. But the common interest told him not to catch, because he would break his promise and he would have problems with the other ones, who would of course accuse him of being guilty of permitting the stag to escape. Ladies and gentlemen, confronted by such a dilemma, what would you have done? Yes, you. What would you have done? Would you have acted egoistically, or would you have acted altruistically? Would you have kept your promise to cooperate, to go on cooperating until the successful killing of the stag, or would you have preferred to seize the rabbit? According to Rousseau, the dilemma was resolved in favor of the particular, private, singular, short-term interest of the hunter seeing the rabbit within his reach. Listen to Rousseau. If a stag was to be taken, everyone saw that in order to succeed, he must abide faithfully to his post. But if a rabbit happens to come within the reach of any one of them, it is not to be doubted. It is not to be doubted that he pursued the rabbit without scruple, and having seized his prey, cared very little if by doing so he caused his companions to miss the stag. The stag hunter, in other words, ends up becoming a rabbit hunter. He breaks his promise, he does not keep his promise, he prefers to privilege his singular, private, short-term interest at the expense of the common long-term interest of all the primitive hunters taken together. Why did he decide to act the way he did? Why did he prefer his own interest? Not because of his egoism. The noble savage is not egoist. Noble savage in Rousseau's state of nature is different from the homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to another man, which characterizes the state of nature of Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan, we saw it. It is not because of evil, egoistic human nature inciting men to try to dominate any other man. No, in Rousseau's state of nature, the fact to privilege the private short-term interest is due to the subjective uncertainty felt by the hunter who sees the rabbit. That is to say, said hunter cannot be sure of what the other hunter will do in the case the rabbit comes within the reach of this other hunter. The first hunter, in other words, cannot trust the other hunters. Why is he unable to trust them? Why is he unable to trust the fellow hunters? because there is no authority telling all the hunters what to do and punishing them in the case they do not do what they are supposed to do. In other words, it is the absence of a common authority, the anarchical structure of the state of nature, today's anarchy. If we apply this to international relations, this is what Kenneth Waltz will be doing. I will come back to this in a minute. Because in the state of nature, there is no central authority, no primitive hunter can trust no other primitive hunter. He who trusts another hunter runs the risk of being victim of this other hunter cheating. China is cheating. This is what Trump said when justifying his protectionist policy. It is the anarchical structure, to sum up this point, which explains why primitive men act and why they do have to act unilaterally. They cannot but act unilaterally for the very simple reason that they cannot afford to act multilaterally, because they cannot trust the other primitive hunters. They cannot be sure of the other primitive hunters' future behavior. Waltz takes up this metaphor in his Man, the State and War, page 168, page 169, and this is how he applies it to international politics. I quote Thomas Hobbes: "The story is simple." I also put it on document number 3. The story is simple, the implications are tremendous. In cooperative action, even when all agree on the objective pursued, catch the prey called a stag. Even where all agree on the goal, on the objective, even if all have an equal interest in being successful, one cannot rely on others. One cannot rely on others. The sources of conflict are not so much in the mind of man, in human nature, as they are in the nature of social activity. In the stag hunt example, and he refers to also the tension between one man's immediate interest and the general long-term interest of the group, this tension is resolved by the unilateral action of one man. Reason would have told him that his long-run interest depends on establishing cooperation, which will benefit all the participants. But reason also tells him that if he forgoes the rabbit, the man next to him, the hunter next to him, would leave his post to chase the rabbit, leaving the first man with nothing but food for thought on the folly of being lowly, the folly or the foolishness of being loyal. He who is loyal is stupid. Why? Because he will be victim of the other actor profiting from this ingenuousness to cheat. In other words, for Kenneth Waltz, in an anarchical structure such as the international environment, self-help, that is unilateralism, is the only rational, because the only rewarding behavior. No state can trust no other state, and therefore cooperation is almost impossible to emerge, since it would be foolish to bet on the other states behaving according to their promises. A radical stance adopted by Kenneth Waltz, very radical. Strictly speaking, no cooperation is possible. The problem with this theoretically radical stance, of course, is that empirical reality refutes this claim that no cooperation is possible. States do cooperate every day. They cooperate bilaterally. They cooperate at the regional level. They cooperate multilaterally at the systemic level, the worldwide level. They establish international institutions, international organizations. They sign treaties the UN Charter, the Kyoto Protocol, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, transformed into the World Trade Organization. These institutions, neo-realists, strictly speaking, cannot explain why they exist. Strictly speaking, they cannot explain why they exist. Walz is not even interested in taking them into account for the very simple reason that he considers them to be secondary actors that do not deserve his attention as a scholar, since he focuses on major powers. He considers to be the only genuine actors on the international scene. Who then takes international institutions seriously? Logically, neoliberals take international institutions seriously. And they claim that they can explain why international institutions do exist. In order to do so, what do? They refer to another dilemma. They also refer to game theory. But it's not the stag-hunt metaphor that they refer to. It is the prisoner's dilemma, which is their preferred game to which they apply to international relations. In this prisoner's dilemma, which is also a metaphor, of course, two criminals are jailed by the district attorney because they have committed a crime, or this is what the district attorney believes, they have committed a crime. The two criminals are called, their names are Bonnie and Clyde.
Bonnie and Clyde.
Bonnie and Clyde are suspected to have committed a crime, to have killed the sheriff. And they are separately jailed, this is very important, in the prison. By the district attorney, and the district attorney, of course, wants to boost his career by punishing them. And to make sure that he will be able to punish at least one of them, he calls them separately, this is important, into his office to make the following proposal to Bonnie, to Clyde. Let's start with Clyde. To Clyde, he says, if tomorrow you admit having committed the crime you are accused of, together with Bonnie, if you admit you are guilty, and if Bonnie refuses to admit she is guilty too, I will put her into the jail for 10 long years, and you will be set free. And of course, when calling Bonnie into his office, he makes the same proposal to her. Bonnie and Clyde, however, as you can guess, are pretty smart. And so they ask separately the two following questions, each one. First question, if none of us admits having committed the crime, having killed the sheriff, what will happen? In this case, this is the response of the district attorney. In this case, well, you will be jailed for 1 year only because I have no definitive evidence of your being guilty. Okay. And the second question asked both by Bonnie and by Clyde is the following one. If both of us, if we do acknowledge, if we confess our crime, what will happen then? Well, this is the response of the district attorney. In this case, I can punish both of you, which is good news for my career. But you know that a confessed crime is a forgiven crime, so you will be put into jail merely for 3 years and not for 10 years. So 4 possibilities to be set free. If you admit your crime and your partner does not admit his or her crime. 1 year jail if both refuse to confess their crime. 3 years if both confess their crime, but in this case it is partly forgiven. And 10 years if you do not confess your crime and the other one accepts to acknowledge that both committed the crime. So Bonnie and Clyde then logically return to their office, to their cell, to their prison cell. And they have the whole night to think about the strategy to adopt tomorrow when they will be called by the district attorney. What then is the best strategy? The best strategy for Clyde, and the same is true for Bonnie, the best strategy is to admit he committed the crime, hoping that Bonnie will not confess. In this case, he will be set free and Bonnie will be put into jail for 10 years. The second best hypothesis for Clyde, but the reciprocal argument is valid, of course. The second best hypothesis for Clyde would be to be jailed for 1 year. So it's worse than being set free by definition. So it's the second best solution, to be jailed for 1 year in the case he and Bonnie both refuse to confess. The third best solution, which also is the second worst solution, is to be put into jail for 3 years in the case both confess their crime, both accept, acknowledging, recognizing that they killed the sheriff. And of course, the worst solution for Clyde is that he refuses to confess while Bonnie confesses. He then would be put into jail and Bonnie would be set free. 4 possibilities. And of course, for both Clyde and for Clyde and for Bonnie, the most rational solution consists in admitting his and her guilt, in order not to be jailed for 10 years in the case the other one accepts to confess the crime. Ladies and gentlemen, logically then, the day after, when Clyde is called into the office of the district attorney, he accepts to acknowledge that he shot the sheriff.
Shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot no deputy. It was I who shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot no deputy.
So Clyde admits he shot the sheriff. And of course, Bonnie also confesses her crime. Listen to Bonnie. I shot the sheriff. I did not shoot the deputy, but I shot the sheriff, both Bonnie and Clyde, and more specifically, Bob Marley and Eric Clapton's chorists, female chorists, acknowledged, confessed their crime. They are therefore put into jail during 3 years. 3 years is better than 10 years, so it is a rational decision they took when confessing their crime. From the individual point of view, it was rational to confess. But this rational decision from an individual point of view is not rational from a collective point of view. If Bonnie and Clyde had both refused to confess, they would have been jailed for only 1 year, which is a better outcome by definition than 3 years. In other words, there is an opposition between individual rationality and collective rationality. A rational decision from an individual point of view reveals itself to be irrational from a collective point of view. The question then asked by neoliberals, why did the two prisoners, why did Bonnie and Clyde admit their guilt? Why didn't they refuse both to confess? Well, according to neoliberals, and more specifically Robert Keohane in his book After Hegemony, he's the leading neoliberal scholar during this debate. The suboptimal outcome, that is to say, the 3 years in jail rather than the one single year, this suboptimal outcome is due to the subjective uncertainty. Each prisoner, Bonnie and Clyde at the same time, felt relatively to the other prisoners' behavior. None of them, neither Bonnie nor Clyde, dared to refuse to confess because he or she could not be sure that Clyde or Bonnie would too refuse to admit his or her guilt. And why couldn't they be sure? Because, and here I come back to the starting point of the prisoner's dilemma, the metaphor, they were separately jailed. They were in two different cells and they could not communicate with one another. The absence of communication, therefore, prevents them to know what the other one will do. Therefore, according to Keohane, and I quote him, the prisoner's dilemma model, the metaphor game of the two prisoners, illustrates, I quote, the ways in which barriers of information and communication, barriers of information and communication can impede cooperation. They can create discord, even when common interests exist, even when a common interest should have inside it the actors, the states, or the two prisoners to cooperate. In other words, yes, states are incited to adopt a self-help policy, as was claimed by Waltz, but this is only the second best solution. It is the second best solution because if they had been able to foresee what the other one would say to the district attorney, if they had been able to foresee that, they could have known with certainty this other one's behavior. And in this case, they could both have come to the conclusion that they could afford not to confess. And in this case, they would have been jailed for 1 year rather than for 3. question then, the next question asked by liberals is the following one: how can actors anticipate other actors' behavior? How can states anticipate other states' behavior? This question is crucial in the liberal approach. Why? Because in the liberal approach, and this goes back to Robert Keohane's own academic past, before being a neoliberal, he was a transnationalist, and he emphasized interdependence. States are interdependent from each other. That is to say, they know that they will have interaction today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, etc. So states, because they are interdependent, must anticipate the shadow of the future. This is not the case for realists. Realists go back to Rousseau and claim that basically states, just as primitive men, are independent from each other. Therefore, they do not necessarily have to think of what their future relations will be, since they focus on security rather than on well-being. So the prisoner's dilemma is a repeated game, and therefore it is important for neoliberals such as Keohane, it is important for states to know what their future relations will consist in. In other words, they are interested in cooperating in order to improve their future relations. And here then appears the role of international institutions. International institutions, international regimes, international norms, international treaties, international organizations reduce, I quote, uncertainty. And in doing so, they facilitate cooperation. They facilitate cooperation. Detailed argumentation is the following. A state which signs a treaty, a state that commits itself into an international regime, a state that becomes a member of an international organization, well, by definition, accepts the rules of the game. It agrees with the principles defended by the regime. It seeks to promote the objectives of the international organization. And by agreeing, by accepting, by promoting, its behavior is foreseeable. Other states, therefore, will know what to expect from this other state's behavior in the future. And reciprocally, every state will know what every other state will know how every other state will behave in the future by becoming a member of an international organization, by signing an international treaty, by committing itself into an international regime. And therefore, international institutions exist. States established a UN Charter in order to because they promised not to go to war. They adopted the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization because they promised not to practice protectionist policies. They signed the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Accord of 2015 because they promised to protect international environment, to fight against climate change. And therefore, international institutions exist and they favor cooperation. Cooperation, therefore, is possible and rewarding. Every state profits from cooperation. Neorealists, logically, and I come back to the debate, do not accept this optimistic analysis. Since they have to acknowledge that international cooperation exists, since they have to acknowledge that international institutions exist, despite Kenneth Waltz's radical stance, and all the more so despite Morgenthau's or Mearsheimer's offensive radical stance, what do? They join the debate by focusing not necessarily on the emergence of cooperation, which obviously exists, but by focusing on the difficulty for cooperation to prevail on the long run. the most important author here is Joseph Grieco. Joseph Grieco, in the book of Baldwin, summing up presenting the major articles of this debate. Here is Joseph Grieco's contribution, Anarchy and the Limits of Cooperation. According to Grieco, liberals, neoliberals, commit one mistake when they believe that international institutions provide information about the state, about the behavior of states. Why? Because according to Grieco, this information does not protect states in the domain, which is, according to him and realists, the most important consequence of anarchy, that is to say, in the domain of security. Anarchy, I quote Grieco, means that there is no overarching authority to prevent states from using violence or the threat of violence to destroy or to enslave them. States can never be sure that one day or another, sooner or later, they cannot be sure that they will not be attacked by another. There is a kind of sort of Damocles above the heads of the states, the risk of war. Therefore, states must always consider this possibility. In other words, they have first and foremost to guarantee their survival. And Grieco refers to Raymond, who summed up in his Peace and War, the book that I already mentioned in past classes. Raymond proposed a phrase, formula: to survive is to win. To survive is to win. For Grieco too, states first and foremost have to survive. What does that mean? This means that when cooperating or when considering the possibility of cooperating or not, they have to take into account the impact of this cooperation about the states, the partners' gains. Because if the partner, who also is a rival and not merely a partner, if this partner or this rival gains more than the first state, then this first state relatively is losing, although maybe gaining in absolute terms. And even in the economic domain, this is true. For realists, economic cooperation also is a zero-sum gain and not a positive gain. In a positive game, both players win. In a zero-sum game, only one can win, the other one loses. In this case, there is also the possibility of both to draw if no one gains more than the other one. According to Grieco, states accept to cooperate only if at least they do not gain less than the partner, who by definition is also a prospective rival. Listen to Grieco. States worry that today's friend may be tomorrow's enemy. In a war, it fears that achievements in joint gains, the ones that are emphasized by liberals, Bonnie and Clyde both have the joint advantage if they refuse to confess, if they cooperate among each other and do not confess to the district attorney. States fear that achievements in joint gains, that advantage of friends in the present, might produce a more powerful, more dangerous potential enemy in the future. Relative gains, in other words, are more important than absolute gains. And here, basically, we come back to the roots of the difference opposing realists to liberals. Liberals basically think that states are looking for wealth, for the well-being of their population. And therefore, any cooperation ending up in absolute positive gains is worth being started. Because absolute gains, by definition, means a higher wealth for the population. The realists think that states, first and foremost, look for their security. And then, if then the partner, which is potentially an adversary, gains more, this rival is likely to dedicate in the future a significant part of this gains, dedicate them to military expenditures in order to increase its military strength, thus becoming a danger to the first state who, by definition, gained less, that is to say, lost, actually, relatively speaking, compared to the other ones, lost when deciding to accept the cooperation. And Diego quotes Waltz in his Theory of International Politics, the major book of Kenneth Waltz, published in 1979. This is what Waltz said: when faced with the possibility of cooperating for mutual gains, states that feel insecure must ask how the gain will be divided between the two. They are compelled to ask not, will both of us gain? This is the question asked by liberals. Will both of us gain? But they will be compelled to ask, who will gain more? Who will gain more? If an expected gain is to be divided in the ratio of 2 to 1, one state may use its disproportionate gain relative to the other to implement a policy intended to damage the other. The condition of insecurity more than of uncertainty, the condition of insecurity works against cooperation, because states first and foremost look for their security, are in silence by the anarchical structure. To look for their security, they cannot afford to accept a cooperation synonymous with more gains for the other partner, which is potentially a rival. In other words, to sum up this neo-realist counter-argument against the neoliberal optimistic argument, according to neo-realists, cooperation is a zero-sum game, not a positive game. A state either loses or draws or wins. Cooperation is possible only if a state committing itself in the cooperation at least draws, or if possible, wins. If it knows that it will lose, that is to say, gain less than the other one, it will not accept to cooperate. Or, of course, if we take into account the chronological evolution of cooperation, it may change its mind if, after winning during a certain period, or at least after drawing during a significant period, it starts losing, or it comes to the conclusion that it is about to lose, or it perceives this cooperation to be more favorable to the partner, which therefore is perceived as a danger, as a rival, then it gains itself. Only balanced achievements, expected, at least balanced achievements, permit cooperation to emerge, and all the more so to go on the long run. In other words, states do accept to cooperate and to accept to continue to cooperate as long if and only as long as this cooperation reproduces the status quo, at least. It must at least reproduce the status quo, that is to say, the state A, committing itself into cooperation, must know that it will be at least be as maintain its position after the cooperation. This then, ladies and gentlemen, permits us to understand why America was a regime maker in 45, and why now Trump's America is tempted to become a regime breaker. In 1945, thanks to America's victory in World War II, America indeed could expect, thanks to the UN in the security domain, thanks to the general agreement on tariffs and trade in the commercial trade domain, that it could expect that by establishing these rules, it would itself gain at least as much as the secondary powers, the so-called regime takers. And this is the reason why all these institutions were established in the US. You know that the UN building is in New York. You know that the UN conference was held, that is the conference establishing the UN as an institution and proposing the UN Charter, drafting the UN Charter. This conference took place in San Francisco. You know that the IMF was invented in Dumbarton Oaks district of Washington, D.C. This proves that America is at the origin, took the initiative of launching these multilateral institutions, because it was sure, rightly so, that by establishing these institutions, it would consolidate over the long run, legitimate over the long run, its preeminence acquired thanks to its victory in World War II. In other words, the neo-realist theory of cooperation states to cooperate at last as the status quo is reproduced, joins Gilpin's power cycle theory. A hegemonic power has an interest in establishing institutions because it reproduces the status quo, at least, that is to say, it permits the preeminent power to go on prevailing, to remain the hegemonic power. And this preeminent power will make these institutions work smoothly. That is to say, the preeminent power is the kind of substitute, ersatz, to use the German term, which is often used in French and in English too. It is the substitute of the absent overarching authority. There is no overarching authority telling states what to do, but there is a preeminent power establishing rules and also sanctioning indirectly those secondary weak powers that do not respect these rules. In the absence of such a hegemonic power, when there is no more preeminence, when there is no more unipolarity, cooperation is likely to no longer work. Multilateralism is no longer likely to prevail. It is likely to be replaced by unilateralism. And the historical record, ladies and gentlemen, corroborates this hypothesis. In the domain of security, when was the first international security regime established? In 1815, during the Vienna Congress. It was the then European Council of Powers. Who was favorable to establishing the European Council of Powers? It was Great Britain, because Great Britain had defeated Napoleon. It established, therefore, the so-called quintuple alliance, quadruple, and then quintuple. Once again, France was invited to join the quadruple alliance, which became the quintuple alliance, in order to maintain, thanks to this concert, the peace, the security in at least Western Europe. And when Great Britain decided that it should no longer respect this non-formalized, this informal international institution called the European Council of Powers, wars broke out, for instance, the Crimean War in 1854. When was the second international regime created in the domain of international security? In 1919, the League of Nations was created. Its aim was to make war impossible, to make a new world war similar to World War I, to make such a war impossible. You know that the League of Nations failed to maintain peace. It did not prevent Mussolini from invading African territories. It did not prevent Japan, Imperial Japan, from invading the East Asian continent, China notably. and to establish its sphere of co-prosperity. It did not prevent Hitler from remilitarizing the left bank of the Rhine River, from invading first Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and then Poland. Why was the League of Nations? Why did the League of Nations fail? Because Great Britain was no longer hegemonic, though we believe to some extent it still was. And the US did not accept, despite its material resources, did not accept to assume the responsibilities of a world leader. You know that the US Senate, we mentioned this at the beginning, refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty, and therefore the US did not become a member of the League of Nations. You also know that during this interwar period in 1929, the Great Depression broke out, the great economic and financial crisis. Why? Because the pound sterling, the British pound sterling, which had been the international currency, permitting international trade to boom during the 19th century, this British pound sterling was too weak, and the American dollar, which became the new international currency in 1945, was not yet recognized as such, and the Americans did not accept that this could be the case. So the examples, ladies and gentlemen, of 1815 and 1945 on the one hand, and the counterexample of 1919 on the other hand, lead us to the conclusion that in order for multilateralism to prevail, there must be a hegemonic power on the international scene. And this is the reason why many contemporary criticisms raised against the US, the so-called US hegemony, are at best irrelevant, because those who criticize the US actually lack conceptual rigor. At best, they lack conceptual rigor. This is the case, I'm sorry, of Emmanuel Macron, when he criticizes what he believes to be American hegemony. Listen to Macron. It is a speech held in 2018 when he denounced America's, what he considers to be America's hegemony.
Je redirai pour ma part au président Trump ce qu'on vient d'expliquer l'un et l'autre, c'est que les mesures prises sont contre-productives, y compris pour son économie. Je redirai aussi une question qui est pour moi une question de principe. On ne peut pas faire la guerre commerciale entre des alliés. Nous sommes tous engagés dans des conflits, en Syrie, en Irak, au Sahel, dans différents endroits du monde. Nous sommes alliés, nous échangeons des informations critiques. Nos soldats se tiennent côte à côte pour défendre la liberté et nos valeurs. On ne peut pas, entre alliés, dans le contexte international que nous connaissons, décider de guerre commerciale. C'est une question pour moi de principe. Et enfin, j'essaierai de convaincre avec le Premier ministre Trudeau et l'ensemble de nos partenaires pour qu'on retrouve un chemin de normalisation des sujets commerciaux, parce qu'il faut trouver une issue à cette tension. Les 6 autres pays du G7, c'est un marché qui est plus grand que le marché américain. Donc il faut le regarder en face. Je veux dire, il n'y a pas d'hégémonie mondiale si nous savons nous organiser. Et nous n'avons pas envie qu'il y en ait. Moi, je crois à la coopération, au multilatéralisme, parce que de toutes mes forces, je résiste à l'hégémonie. L'hégémonie, c'est la loi du plus fort. L'hégémonie, c'est la fin de la règle de droit. L'hégémonie, c'est la fin des garanties qu'on peut donner à nos concitoyens, qu'on les protège selon des valeurs que nous avons défendues et fait passer dans ces textes. Et donc, peut-être que ça est égal au président américain aujourd'hui d'être isolé, mais nous, ça nous est aussi égal d'être à 6, si besoin était, parce que ces 6-là représentent des valeurs, représentent un marché économique qui a cette force de l'histoire et qui surtout représente une vraie force au niveau international aujourd'hui.
Of course, the video which you can find on Moon is you can find the link to have access to it on YouTube. The video is there are the English translation of this French discourse. Macron commits a mistake. He commits confusion, which I alluded to at the beginning of today's class. He rejects hegemony because he confuses, he confounds, he mistakes hegemony for empire. Empires act unilaterally. Hegemons do not act unilateral hegemons establish multilateral rules which they then defend and which they compel other states to respect. The existence of a hegemonic power is the condition that must be fulfilled in order for international institutions, in order for international multilateral organizations to be efficient. It is precisely because Trump perceives America to no longer be hegemonic, to no longer be materially preeminent. It is precisely because of this perception that Trump refuses to go on respecting international regimes. It is because of this reason that he decides to act unilaterally, because he thinks that in the case of America respecting these institutions, the other states will be better off. And therefore the US from RegimeMaker, when it was the hegemon, from 45 roughly to 2015, 2016. This is the reason why the US from RegimeMaker is now transforming itself into a regime breaker. America considers that China is profiting from the existing rules that the US established when it was powerful. Trump thinks that Iran is cheating. Trump believes that Europeans are free riding, profiting from international institutions. We'll see this when dealing with NATO. And therefore, he resorts to unilateral decisions. Therefore, he claims that America, from now onwards, those days are past, are over. The first discourse we heard at the very beginning of today's class. Therefore, he decides that from now onwards, America will act in America's national interest. Macron is right when anticipating the potential negative consequences of America's behavior, which to some extent amounts to saying that he would like America to go on being hegemonic, though he does not know what hegemony actually is. Macron is right, despite himself, therefore, when anticipating the potential negative consequences of America's unilateral behavior. If America supposed to maintain the efficiency, to maintain the efficiency of international institutions, to monitor the behavior of other states, if America no longer plays this role on the international scene, then the other states will be tempted to act unilaterally too. And then, yes, the international liberal order cherished by Macron will be endangered. Such a liberal international order indeed presupposes a liberal hegemon, as proven by John Mersheimer in his very last book. You'll find an excerpt of The Great Delusion, this is the title of the book, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. You'll find an excerpt of this book in the very last slide of today's file. Since America no longer guarantees the smooth functioning of international multilateral institutions, then the other states might be tempted to act unilaterally too. This is what happened in World War I, at the eve of World War I in the commercial domain. This is what happened in the 1930s in the security domain. There is thus a risk, ladies and gentlemen, of the contemporary order being upset until a new hegemon emerges. Guess who? Well, I think you have the answer, at least. If you have no answer, this is the question concluding today's topic. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the possibility to relax during Bob Marley's and Eric Clapton's musical intervention. Great day. I wish you a great day, and I hope you'll be back next week. Goodbye.